The terminal buzzed with movement, families pulling roller bags, professionals lost in the glow of their devices, announcements echoing across steel and glass. In the middle of the morning rush, Elena Brooks stood still, a quiet force amid the chaos. The strap of her weathered leather travel bag rested firmly on her shoulder, and though her clothes were casual, just jeans and a pale blue button-up shirt, there was something unmistakable about the way she carried herself. She didn't walk through the airport as a traveler might, with the nervous energy of someone unfamiliar with the flow of terminals and boarding gates. She moved with precision, her steps fluid, her eyes scanning not out of uncertainty, but quiet observation, like someone who had studied this world from both within and above. Elena had spent over 20 years in the skies, most of them at the helm of fighter jets and transport aircraft as a decorated U.S. Air Force pilot. She'd flown through storms that rattled the soul, touched down on remote runways in foreign lands, and made split-second decisions that had changed the course of lives. Not that anyone looking at her now would know. And that was the way she liked it. This trip was supposed to be different, her first as a civilian. Her first flight not bound by a mission plan or military directive. She'd booked a first-class ticket, more out of a desire to ease the stiffness in her knees than to prove anything to anyone, and was headed to see her younger sister and her niece, who had just started walking. That thought alone brought a softness to her expression, a brief smile tugging at the corners of her lips. But beneath that warmth was something else, something quieter and heavier. Retirement had not come with fanfare or parades, just a final salute, a box of medals, and a silence that she hadn't quite gotten used to. The uniform was folded neatly back home, her name stitched across the chest like a memory. Elena didn't miss the long hours or the noise of the engine, but she did miss the sense of purpose, the weight of the sky resting in her hands. The security line wound forward slowly, and as she waited, Elena became aware of the subtle shift in energy around her. It was always the same, the way some people looked twice when they saw her in the first-class line, the flicker in their eyes when they scanned her face, her brown skin, her simple clothes, and then looked away as if they'd seen something that didn't quite compute. She had stopped keeping track of how often it happened, but even now, after all these years, after everything she had done, everywhere she had been, it still stung, just a little, not enough to stop her, not enough to break her stride, but enough to make her fingers curl just a little tighter around the strap of her bag, enough to feel it, like a pebble in your boot, small but persistent. The woman at the check-in desk barely glanced up. Elena offered her ticket and ID with a polite smile, and the agent paused, just a second too long before taking them. Her eyes lingered on the first-class label on the boarding pass, and then on Elena's face, trying to stitch together a narrative that would make it make sense. Elena had seen this story play out before. She could practically hear the silent questions behind the agent's pleasant but shallow smile. Are you sure this is your seat? Was this upgraded by someone else? Are you in the right line? But none of it was said aloud. It never was. That was the trick of it. The thousand quiet ways people asked her to prove who she was without ever speaking a word. Enjoy your flight, Miss Brooks, the agent finally said, her tone polished but lacking depth. Elena nodded and replied with quiet grace, "Thank you," before moving on. She could have corrected her, could have said something, could have leaned into the silence and filled it with all the truth she carried, the hours logged, the storms weathered, the weight of command. But she didn't. Not today. She had nothing to prove, not to a ticket agent, not to the passengers behind her whispering assumptions, not even to herself. Still, she felt the familiar ache settle in her chest. Not anger exactly, more like a tired sadness, the kind that came from knowing that the world still struggled to recognize what didn't fit its expectation. She had earned her place. She always had. At the gate, Elena stood at the edge of the boarding area, her eyes drifting toward the tarmac. The early sunlight struck the wing of the plane in gold, casting long shadows on the concrete. She remembered the first time she touched a control yoke, just 19 years old, trembling with the thrill and terror of it all, and smiled to herself. That cockpit had been her sanctuary, the sky her teacher, the clouds her compass. No one could take that from her. Not a sideways glance, not a forced smile. not a gate agent who couldn't see past a button-up shirt and a low ponytail. Today wasn't about medals or accolades. It was about presence, about claiming space in a world that often questioned her right to it. Elena walked forward when her group was called, handed over her boarding pass, and stepped onto the jet bridge with the same quiet confidence she had carried through every storm in her career. She was no longer in uniform, but her bearing said everything. Elena Brooks didn't need to announce who she was. She had already lived it. It began with a glance, not long, not sharp, just a flicker. A moment of subtle skepticism that passed across the gate agent's face the instant Elena Brooks stepped into the first-class boarding line. She'd seen it 100 times before, in different cities, behind different counters, worn by different people. But the expression was always the same. Confusion wrapped in politeness, surprise barely veiled behind a smile. A question that never needed to be spoken aloud. Are you sure you belong here? Dressed in simple jeans and a button-up shirt, her modest leather bag slung over one shoulder, Elena didn't look like the stereotypical first-class traveler. She didn't come wrapped in a designer suit or trailing expensive perfume. She came as herself, a retired Air Force pilot with 2 decades of service behind her, a woman whose calm presence had guided aircraft through war zones and typhoons, who had commanded cockpits thousands of miles from home. But in the sterile stillness of the boarding area, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the way she was seen, and the way she wasn't. She handed the agent her boarding pass and ID with steady hands, her face composed. The agent's fingers hovered over the barcode scanner, her eyes narrowing just slightly as they moved from Elena's face to the words first class printed in bold on the pass. There was no hostility in her voice, just that hollow, performative cheerfulness that so often coded disbelief. Thank you, Miss Brooks, she said. But the slight hesitation before speaking, Elena's name said more than the words ever could. Elena gave a nod, taking back her ID and walking past without a word, but inside something sharp twisted in her chest. It wasn't rage, it never had been. It was the slow erosion of being made invisible and hypervisible at the same time. It was the feeling of being questioned without being asked, accused without being charged, measured without being known. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, her mind went quiet, like it always did in the final moments before a flight. She wasn't a woman carrying a resentment. She was a pilot carrying muscle memory. But today she was a passenger, and with every step forward, she reminded herself that she was here for joy, not confrontation. She was here to see her niece, to sit still in the sky without responsibility, pulling her toward the cockpit. But then came the second wave, the captain. Tall, silver-haired, and immaculately dressed in a Navy uniform with gleaming bars on his shoulders, Captain Raymond Blake stood just beyond the door, smiling thinly as he greeted boarding passengers. His voice was smooth, practiced, but as Elena crossed the threshold into the first-class cabin, his smile faltered. Just for a second, just enough. His eyes scanned her face, her clothes, the duffel bag in her hand, and he stepped slightly into her path. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, polite on the surface, but with an undertone that carried the distinct weight of challenge. "Are you sure this is your seat?" It hit her like cold water, familiar and unwelcome. Her boarding pass was already visible on her tray table, neatly laid out. She hadn't even sat down yet. "Yes," Elena replied, her voice steady as stone. "I'm sure." His eyes darted to the pass, then back to her. She could see the moment he registered it, the slight tightening of his jaw, the mask of civility barely holding. "Sometimes people get confused about seat assignments," he said, his tone dripping with practiced concern. "Just wanted to make sure everything's in order." The implication was clear. You don't look like you belong here. There it was, the wound made fresh. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't give him the satisfaction of defensiveness. "Everything's in order, Captain," she said calmly, "but thank you for checking." He held her gaze for a moment as if searching for something, defiance, anger, an apology, but found only composure. He nodded curtly and turned away. Behind her, another passenger chuckled softly, the sound slicing the silence like a knife. "She showed him," someone whispered. Amusement in their voice, but it felt more like mockery than support. Elena sat down in her window seat, exhaled quietly, and looked out into the clouds. She wasn't new to this. She wasn't surprised. But some days, no matter how strong you are, the weight still presses down. And it didn't end there. Moments later, the flight attendant passed by offering champagne, skipping Elena entirely, only to backtrack when she asked for water. The man across the aisle looked at her with curiosity, then thinly veiled disdain. Somewhere behind her, someone murmured about upgrades and earning your place. It was all there, simmering just beneath the surface. The quiet disbelief, the polite condescension, the refusal to accept that someone like her, black, female, unadorned, could inhabit this space without explanation. They didn't know her past, and they didn't care. To them, she was out of place. But what they didn't understand was that Elena Brooks had spent her entire life walking into rooms where people didn't expect her. And every time she had stayed, every time she had taken her place, not with noise or anger, but with unshakable grace. It wasn't just about a seat in first class. It never was. It was about the countless moments like this that had tried to tell her who she wasn't. And every time she had answered not with words, but with presence, with excellence, with endurance. And yet, even strength has its breaking point. Even the most composed among us carry a silent ache, the ache of being questioned, doubted, overlooked, again. And as the plane lifted into the sky, rattling with turbulence that mirrored the unease inside her, Elena stared out the window and made a quiet vow. They wouldn't shake her. Not this time. Not ever. She had flown through storms greater than this, both in the air and on the ground. She would not be reduced to anyone's assumptions. But what none of them knew, not the captain, not the passengers, not the crew, was that before this flight touched down, Elena Brooks would not just be seen. She would be needed. The woman they questioned would become the woman they relied on. And when the storm came, real and terrifying and unrelenting, they would have no choice but to reckon with the truth that the person they had doubted was the one who would save them. So stay with this story. Remember this moment, the subtle slights, the silent wounds, the strength that chose stillness over rage. Because in the chapters ahead, when the clouds roll in and the plane begins to falter, you'll witness what real composure looks like. You'll see how quiet power rises. You'll learn what leadership means when it isn't asked for, but is essential. Because Elena Brooks is not here to prove anything. She's here to fly. Elena Brooks sat in her first-class seat, angled toward the window, her spine straight but not rigid, her hands folded gently in her lap. Outside, the morning sun filtered through thick clouds, casting shifting shadows across the wing. The hum of the engines provided a soothing backdrop, and she tried to lose herself in the quiet rhythm of the sky. But the discomfort in her chest lingered, not from fear or turbulence, but from something far more familiar. The aftermath of subtle wounds that left no visible scars. She had spent a lifetime navigating spaces where her presence was questioned, her competence assumed improbable, her excellence tolerated only after it became undeniable. And even here, in a plush seat she had paid for, in a cabin promising calm and luxury, she could still feel the sting of judgment like a splinter beneath the skin. But Elena did what she had always done. She didn't flinch. She didn't react. She carried it in silence, her dignity and armor no one could take from her. Earlier, as she passed through the cabin, she'd caught snippets of whispers, fleeting careless comments that weren't meant to wound but still did. A man in a sharp navy blazer had nudged his wife and muttered, "Probably military. Has to be, right? Can't imagine her buying that seat otherwise." The wife had giggled. Elena had heard. She always did. But she hadn't turned, hadn't spoken. She simply moved forward, composed as ever, as though their assumptions were invisible. She knew better than to give energy to small minds. Still, the familiarity of the insult, dressed in disbelief instead of cruelty, wore at her like wind-smoothing stone. The flight attendant came by again, and though Elena had been offered a drink earlier, this time she was skipped entirely. The tray passed in front of her like she wasn't there. The attendant leaned warmly toward the man in the next seat, laughing at a joke Elena hadn't heard, pouring his second glass of champagne with the kind of practiced ease that said, "You belong here." Elena glanced down at her empty tray table, said nothing, and returned her eyes to the window. It wasn't worth the fight. Not yet. Not over bubbles in a glass. But then came the small moment that broke something open. not in rage, but in sorrow. An older woman across the aisle, silver-haired and elegant, wearing pearl earrings and a soft cream scarf, waved the same attendant over and whispered something with a glance in Elena's direction. The attendant smiled and nodded. A moment later, the woman leaned toward Elena and said sweetly, "If you'd like to change seats, dear, I'm sure they can find you something more comfortable in economy. It's a lot quieter back there, less pressure." Elena turned slowly, unsure she'd heard correctly. Her voice, when it came, was soft and careful. "Excuse me?" The woman gave her a look of gentle concern, as though offering kindness. "I just thought you might be more comfortable. These seats can feel closed in. Sometimes people feel out of place. That's all I meant." Out of place, the words sat between them like fog, blurring everything. There was no hostility in the woman's voice, only condescension wrapped in politeness. It wasn't a slur, it wasn't an accusation, but it landed with a cruelty all its own. Elena stared at her for a moment. The silence waited before offering a faint smile. "I appreciate your concern," she said, her tone crisp and measured, "but I'm exactly where I need to be." The woman looked surprised, then offered a flustered smile and turned back to her magazine. And that was that. Elena didn't lean back right away. She sat there, shoulders square, eyes trained on the back of the seat in front of her, letting the moment settle. She had faced jets going down, engines on fire, and wind shear so strong it could tear the wings off a C-17, but these were the wounds that tired her most. The 1,000 paper cuts, the 1,000 reminders. She had earned her place over and over and over again, and still, to some, her presence required explanation, a reason, a story to make it make sense. But Elena didn't crumble. She didn't sigh or cry or clench her fists. She simply breathed, in through her nose, out through her mouth. The slow inhale of a woman reclaiming space. The steady exhale of someone who would not be moved. This was her strength, not loud, not confrontational, but rooted, unshakable. She didn't need to prove anything to a stranger across the aisle. She had done her proving in cockpits high above war zones, in classrooms full of skeptical junior officers, in command centers where the weight of responsibility could crush a lesser spirit. And she had done it all with quiet resolve, with discipline, with grace. She took a small notebook from her bag and began to write. Not about the insult, not about the sting, but about her niece, her plans for the visit, the recipe she wanted to try with her sister. She would not give this woman, this moment, the power to own her attention. That was the final act of defiance, not silence, but choosing joy. To the world, she might have looked passive. But inside, Elena Brooks burned with a fire forged by years of having to stay composed in the face of dismissal. And it was that same fire, that same unyielding dignity, that would soon become something far more visible. Because in just a few hours, when turbulence turned terrifying and composure meant survival, everyone on that flight would discover what calm under pressure really looked like. The captain who questioned her, the attendant who ignored her, the woman who tried to offer her a different seat. They would all learn. So stay with her. Watch what dignity does when the skies turn dark. Watch what quiet strength becomes when the world needs saving. Because Elena Brooks is not done showing them. Not yet. The first jolt felt like a misstep in the sky, just enough of a shudder to pull passengers from their movies or magazines, but not enough to cause alarm. Elena Brooks felt it in her bones before she felt it in her seat. Her body, trained by thousands of flight hours, instinctively shifted, her muscles tensing, her breath catching. She leaned slightly toward the window, scanning the clouds that now clustered in unfamiliar formations, thickening like fists in the distance. The sky had changed. The plane had shifted. Most around her didn't notice, yet, but Elena did. Her fingers curled around the armrest, not in fear but in focus. The rhythm of the engines had altered ever so slightly, like a violin string pulled out of tune, and beneath that, an unsettling silence had began to settle into the first-class cabin. It was the quiet before a storm, and she knew what was coming. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, overly calm, too smooth. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a bit of unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The words sounded rehearsed, almost hopeful. But Elena heard the static under the confidence, the small pause between each sentence. the edge of strain buried under the polish. She closed her eyes for a breath. Not fear, calculation, evaluation. The sudden descent of calm that only came to those who had lived through storms and survived. Then came the second jolt, harder this time, violent enough to tip drinks, unbuckle nerves. Gasps filled the cabin, followed by the loud ding of the seatbelt sign lighting up. A cart rattled wildly near the galley. Overhead compartments shook, one popping open to spill out a neck pillow and a stray book. Lena's eyes narrowed. This wasn't ordinary turbulence. Something deeper was wrong. And in the pit of her stomach, she knew the captain's words were no longer a reassurance. They were a mask, another hit. The plane lurched hard to the right, the cabin shifting at a sickening angle before stabilizing again. A child screamed from somewhere in economy. Passengers clutched armrests, eyes wide, knuckles pale. Panic was a living thing now, slithering up the aisles in whispers and frightened glances. Flight attendants strapped themselves into jump seats, trying to maintain composure. But Elena saw it. She saw the tightness in their jaws, the shaking hands, the silent exchange of worry. This wasn't routine. This was a crisis pretending not to be. And through it all, Elena sat still. Not passive, poised. She heard the change in engine pitch again, deeper this time, uneven. Her breath caught, and her mind raced. That wasn't wind. That was stress. That was the sound of an aircraft struggling to stay in harmony with the sky. Then the intercom came on again. But this time it wasn't the captain. The voice belonged to the co-pilot, and it wavered despite his best efforts to mask it. Ladies and gentlemen, we've entered a severe weather system. We are currently rerouting to avoid the worst of it. Please remain calm and seated. But rerouting in this kind of turbulence? That meant the systems were no longer responding the way they should. That meant visibility was down. That meant air traffic control likely wasn't responding fast enough, if at all. And as if to confirm her fears, the plane shook again with a violent drop that stole the breath from every throat in the cabin. Elena's glass tipped and rolled to the floor. The man across from her gasped audibly, white-knuckled and wide-eyed. Somewhere behind her, someone cried out in fear. And that was when Elena made her decision. She reached for her seatbelt, unfastened it with a click, and rose slowly, balancing herself against the turbulence. The plane was still shifting beneath her feet, but she moved with the surety of someone born in this chaos. A flight attendant, pale-faced and panicked, rushed toward her. "Ma'am, please, you need to sit down." But Elena didn't flinch. "I'm a retired Air Force pilot," she said, her voice low and calm but carrying the weight of authority. "I know this isn't routine. I need to speak to the cockpit." The attendant hesitated, her training clashing with the storm outside and the storm within. Elena placed a steady hand on her arm, not to demand, but to assure. "This isn't just turbulence. I can help, please." The attendant faltered, then nodded, fumbling for the cockpit intercom. "Captain, there's a passenger here. She says she's a pilot, retired Air Force. She insists you might need her." The silence that followed was long, too long. Elena imagined the captain, his pride clashing with his fear, his need for control battling his growing desperation. Then the cockpit door clicked open, and in that moment, Elena wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was what this plane needed. She stepped forward into the cockpit not to take over, but to stabilize, not to outshine, but to save. She saw it immediately. Immediately. The chaos in the readings, the uncooperative weather pattern, the flashing alerts of a failing communication system. The captain was sweating. The co-pilot's hands were trembling. They were flying half-blind in a wounded aircraft through a raging sky. "Manual adjustment," as she said, pointing to the erratic readings. "Autopilot's overcorrecting. You're fighting the plane instead of flying it. Let me help." And he let her. Elena took her place, not by demanding it, but by earning it in real time. With every correction, every calm instruction, the flight steadied. With every second, the fear in the cockpit gave way to focus. And back in the cabin, passengers whispered, wide-eyed. Some recognized her face. Others only saw a woman who had stood when everyone else froze. A woman who moved toward danger without hesitation. So if you're watching this story unfold, cheer for her like this post, share it. Let Elena Brooks' name ring beyond the clouds. Because the woman they question, The woman they overlooked just might be the reason everyone makes it home. She doesn't need your approval, but she's earned your respect. And she's just getting started. Elena Brooks stood at the threshold of the cockpit, the cabin behind her vibrating with fear, the cockpit door before her still closed, like a wall, like a warning. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from panic, but from the gravity of what she was about to do. Behind her, the passengers clutched their armrests in each other, their trust hanging by a thread. Some stared at her with wide eyes, others avoided her gaze entirely, but no one dared to stand. No one moved. No one acted, except her. The plane had just been rocked by its worst jolt yet, a violent drop that sent a drink cart crashing into a bulkhead and screams echoing down the aisle. Overhead compartments had burst open, and the co-pilot's voice had returned to the intercom, tight with strain, urging everyone to remain seated and calm. But Elena knew better. She had flown through worse, and her instincts, refined by years in the Air Force, were no longer whispering. They were screaming. Something was wrong, critically wrong. She didn't know exactly what was failing up front, but she didn't need to. She recognized the rhythm of fear. And fear wasn't supposed to be flying this plane. She turned to the nearest attendant, who looked torn between doing her job and collapsing from anxiety. "Please," Elena said, her voice steady, "I need to speak to the captain. I'm not just a concerned passenger. I'm a retired Air Force pilot. I've flown combat missions in worse storms than this. I can help, but I need you to trust me." The attendant blinked rapidly, trying to push down her panic. I, I can't just, there's a protocol." "I know," Elena interrupted gently. "And if this were a normal flight, I wouldn't be standing here. But it's not. That pitch change, that wasn't just turbulence. It sounded like an engine trying not to fail. And judging by the crew's faces, your pilots are overwhelmed. So yes, follow your protocol. Press the intercom, let them say no, but at least try." The young woman hesitated, then slowly reached for the small panel beside the cockpit door. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the button. "Captain, a passenger is requesting access. She says she's former military, Air Force pilot. She says we might need help." There was silence. Static. Tension thickened in the air around them like smoke. Elena stood still, her posture upright, but her mind bracing. She had no illusions. She knew what she represented to that cockpit. A woman, a black woman, out of uniform, uninvited, and worst of all, right. She could imagine the debate unfolding behind the reinforced door. Pride wrestling with responsibility, ego trying to cling to authority even as the aircraft cried out for more hands, more clarity, more control. Then the intercom crackled. "We're handling it. Tell her to return to her seat." There it was, the dismissal. Not a shout, not a confrontation, just a crisp professional rejection, like an order tossed out of the sky. Elena exhaled through her nose, jaw tight, chest heavy with the familiar sting of being unseen in a moment that demanded vision. But this time, she didn't back down. She stepped forward, closer to the intercom, and pressed the button herself. Her voice came low, calm, unwavering. "Captain, this isn't about undermining you. This is about saving this plane. I've logged over 2 decades of flight time. I've navigated aircraft through combat zones, storms, and engine failures. I've trained pilots who now command fleets, and I know what failing systems feel like. You're not handling it, you're hanging on. Let me in or risk all of us going down because you didn't want help." Another pause, another silence that felt like it lasted a lifetime. Then the click of a latch. The door cracked open, and with that small shift, Elena stepped forward. Not with arrogance, but with purpose. Not to seize power, but to share the burden. The cockpit was dim, lit by glowing panels and flashing warnings. The air was hot, thick with tension. The captain's face was pale and shiny with sweat, his jaw clenched, his grip on the yoke too tight. The co-pilot looked barely older than Elena's niece, his fingers darting across the radio in frustration. "We've lost comms again," he muttered. "Autopilot's not compensating. Engine 3's running hot." Elena took it in with one sweep of her eyes. She didn't need a long explanation. The aircraft was faltering, and the storm ahead wasn't just weather, It was a wall of pressure, wind shear, and instability that demanded surgical precision and absolute focus. "You're overcorrecting," she said, not accusing, just stating. "Manual control will stabilize the engine load, and you need to descend 2,000 feet to get under the worst of the shear. You'll have more lift, more control." Captain Blake hesitated, his pride clinging like a final thread. Then he nodded, slowly, begrudgingly. But he nodded. He let go of the yoke just enough for Elena to guide them. And with that, the dynamic shifted. The cockpit, once closed to her, now made room. Together, they rerouted. Together, they fought the winds. Elena didn't demand command, she offered steadiness. Her voice was a metronome, came in exact. Her hands, even when not touching the controls, moved with the grace of someone who belonged here. And outside, the passengers gripped their seats. They had no idea that the woman they had whispered about, the woman they had doubted, was now the quiet voice steering them towards survival. So if you're still listening to this story, don't scroll past. This isn't just about turbulence or aviation. This is about what it means to stand up when you're told to sit down, to trust your training when others trust only their assumptions, to offer help even when it's not welcomed because lives are on the line. Elena Brooks didn't ask for praise. She didn't demand recognition, but she deserves your support. Comment below if you believe in her, if you've ever been dismissed but refused to stay silent, if you've ever had to prove yourself in a room that didn't see you coming. Because Elena didn't wait for permission to act. She acted because it was right. And that choice may have just saved every soul on that flight. The cockpit was tense, thick with the kind of silence that doesn't mean calm, but the silence of too much happening at once. Lights flashed across the control panels in rhythmic warnings, engine readings creeping past safe thresholds, pressure imbalances blinking like slow heartbeats, in a storm wall on the radar so jagged it looked like a wound in the sky. Elena Brooks stood just inside the door, steady despite the unspoken resistance she could feel radiating from Captain Blake's shoulders. He hadn't said anything since she stepped in. Not "thank you," not "take a seat," not even a nod of acknowledgement. He simply gripped the yoke with white-knuckled hands, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the narrowing window of sky ahead. She could see it all, the fear he refused to show, the control he was desperate not to lose, the pride that was fighting her presence harder than the wind outside ever could. And she understood. Not because she agreed, but because she'd been there before. She knew what it was like to lead under pressure, to be watched, to fear failure when others depended on you. But she also knew what it looked like when someone needed help and didn't know how to ask. She didn't push, she didn't rush, she simply leaned forward, eyes scanning the readings, body language calm, voice measured. "Captain," she said gently, "your pitch is too steep. The autopilot's been overcorrecting for 20 minutes. It's pulling energy from the wrong engines." Blake didn't respond, not right away, but she saw it, the flicker in his gaze, the twitch in his hand as he eased back ever so slightly. He was listening, even if he didn't want to admit it. The co-pilot glanced at Elena, hope flaring briefly behind his exhausted eyes. "We've been trying to stabilize it, but the data's inconsistent. It's like the readings aren't matching the feel of the plane." "They're not," Elena replied calmly. "That's sensor distortion. In this kind of weather, airflow sensors can misfire. You're flying partially blind." The storm hit again, hard. The plane dropped with a bone-rattling shudder, alarms beeping as the altimeter jerked. Blake swore under his breath, fighting the yoke, and Elena reached out, not to take over, but to steady. Her hand hovered beside his, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "Captain, let go of the autopilot. It's hurting you more than helping." Another pause, another war inside him. Then, click. The autopilot disengaged, the yoke loosened, the fight shifted. Elena stepped forward fully now, bracing herself between the seats, her presence anchoring the chaos. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't smug. She was focused, her body in sync with the plane, her eyes locked on the data, her instincts sharpening. "Ease power on engine 3. It's overheating. Transfer the load to 1 and 4. They're cooler. You've still got margin." Blake hesitated, then did as she said. The results were almost immediate. The vibrations lessened, the drops slowed, the aircraft began to respond, not perfectly, but enough. The co-pilot let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She's holding steadier. Blake said nothing, but his hands, which had trembled just minutes ago, found a new rhythm. His shoulders, once locked in tension, dropped just slightly. And when he looked at Elena again, his eyes no longer burned with resistance. They searched for guidance. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to, because this was never about proving herself. It was about saving them all. And Blake was beginning to see that. They worked side by side, wordless at times, moving with an unspoken understanding born from the sky. She offered course corrections, weather avoidance routes, engine throttle guidance. Each time he followed her lead, the aircraft settled more. Each time the cockpit breathed easier. But the moment that cracked something open was small, so small it could have gone unnoticed. Descent to 28,000 feet, she said, noting the wind shear ahead. We'll avoid the worst of the updrafts and reduce drag. Blake nodded, adjusting the altitude. Then quietly he said, "Thank you." Just 2 words, but they meant everything, because they weren't just for the advice. They were an acknowledgement of her presence, her skill, her right to be there. For so long, Elena had been the one who had to stay quiet, the one who absorbed the suspicion, the condescension, the microaggressions dressed in politeness. She had sat in too many rooms where her credentials were questioned. She had been passed over, talked down to, doubted in silence. But here, in this moment, at 30,000 feet, in a storm that threatened to unravel the lives of everyone on board, she was no longer invisible. She was indispensable. And if you're still listening, if your heart is racing with hers right now, let her know. Drop a comment for Elena, because this is what composure looks like under pressure. This is what leadership sounds like when it's not loud, not demanding, but undeniable. This is what strength feels like when the world expects you to shrink, and you rise anyway. The co-pilot gave her a glance full of something like awe. "You flew fighters?" he asked quietly. "F-16s," she said, still scanning the instruments. "But I logged thousands of hours in transports too." Blake finally turned to face her fully. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "How long did you fly?" 23 years, Elena replied softly. "I retired last fall." He exhaled. "Then we're lucky you were on this flight." She didn't answer, not with words, just a nod, because there was still work to do. The storm hadn't passed. The wind still howled outside, and the runway was still far away. But inside this cockpit, trust had taken root. It hadn't come easily. It never did. But it had come through clarity, calm, and courage. And that's how Elena Brooks earned her place, not by demanding it, but by embodying it. So tell her right now, if her story moved you, if her strength inspired you, if her resolve reminded you of your own, drop a comment below. Let her know you see her. Because this woman who stood up when others sat frozen didn't just steady the aircraft, she redefined what it means to lead. The storm didn't let up. It roared like a living thing, the kind that didn't care about titles or flight hours, the kind that wanted to test every inch of steel, every ounce of will. Outside, the sky was a chaotic swirl of gray and black, the wind shoving against the aircraft like an unseen force trying to peel it from the sky. But inside the cockpit, a new kind of stillness had formed, one that didn't come from silence but from trust. Captain Blake, no longer gripping the yoke like a shield, glanced toward Elena Brooks every few seconds now. Not with suspicion, not with resistance, but with respect. They had flown through the worst of the weather together, and every call Elena had made had steadied them. Every adjustment she suggested had pulled them back from the edge. The aircraft was holding. Just barely, but holding. "Alternate runways cleared," the co-pilot said, his voice steadier now. "Shorter strip. Local towers barely getting through, but they've confirmed visual contact." Elena leaned in, her eyes locked on the weather radar, reading it like a story she already knew the ending to. "We'll need to flatten the approach," she said, calm but firm. "That wind's still gusting at low altitudes. You come in too steep, you'll lose lift and bounce. Keep your glide shallow. Let the aircraft settle itself." Blake nodded, his hands now moving with quiet precision. Not mechanical, not fearful, but measured. "Landing gear," the co-pilot checked. Gear is down, locked. The aircraft trembled again, less like panic this time, more like fatigue. The metal body had been fighting for hours, and Elena could feel it in every creak, every vibration. The plane was tired, and it was her job, their job now, to bring it home safely. As they descended, the cloud cover broke for only a moment, and there it was, a thin ribbon of concrete stretching across a wet expanse of field. No runway lights, just floodlights, from emergency vehicles casting yellow halos across the strip. It looked like a fragile thread beneath them, impossibly narrow in the wide-open chaos of the storm. But it was all they had, and it had to be enough. Winds crosswise, Blake muttered, reading the indicator. Strong. You'll have to crab the landing, Elena said softly. Use rudder for alignment. Don't fight the plane. Feel it. Let it guide you. Just keep her level. The co-pilot watched the altitude numbers ticking down. 2,000 feet. The cabin behind them was silent, too, as if even the passengers had collectively held their breath. Somewhere back there were people still whispering about Elena, still trying to figure out how the woman they almost ignored had become the one steering them away from disaster. Some of them had doubted her, dismissed her, but not anymore. Now they waited, hoping the stranger who had once seemed out of place was the very reason they'd lived to see land again. Elena reached forward, her hand resting gently on the back of Blake's seat. Steady now, she said, her voice like a lifeline in the storm. You've got this. The aircraft shuddered as a gust slammed against the left wing, tilting it slightly before Blake corrected with precise rudder input. The nose dipped. The runway grew closer. The windshield was streaked with rain, the field beyond a blur of movement and color. But the plane responded, not perfectly, but enough. 1,000 feet, the co-pilot said. Elena's breath slowed. Her heart pounded, but her hands were still. Visual alignment is good. You're clean. The runway lights flickered in and out of view through the haze, but they were on course. The final descent was happening, and Elena knew this was the moment everything mattered. One wrong move, one hesitation, one slip in judgment, and they would overshoot. Or worse, hit hard and bounce into the storm again. 500, the co-pilot said, voice tight. Blake's jaw clenched. Almost there. The wind howled again, tugging at the wings. The aircraft wobbled, but Blake held her. Elena watched every muscle in his arms tense with control. He wasn't flying with pride now. He was flying with focus and trust. 200. Elena stepped closer, her voice just above a whisper. Now ease her. Don't flare too early. Just let her meet the ground. The runway rushed up beneath them like a wave, and the tires screeched against the asphalt. A hard landing, but not a crash. A solid grip. The aircraft jolted as the brakes engaged, hydroplaning for a terrifying second before finding traction. Blake guided her down the strip, rain splashing up from the wheels, reverse thrusters screaming, the plane's body quaking like it was gasping for air. But they were down. They were safe. A collective cry of relief echoed through the cabin behind them. Gasps, claps, the sound of people breathing again. The cabin lights flickered, the engines whined low, and the plane, scarred but intact, rolled to a stop under the yellow glow of the emergency vehicles. In the cockpit, no one spoke for a long moment. Then Blake exhaled, his voice catching in his throat. We made it. The co-pilot nodded slowly. Thanks to her. They all turned to look at Elena, who stood there, silent, her eyes damp but clear. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything. She had been doubted, dismissed, asked if she belonged. And then she saved them all. So if you're still here, still listening, this is the moment to speak up. This is the moment to comment below and say, we see you, Elena. Because this wasn't just a safe landing. It was a quiet victory over every moment she was questioned, every assumption she had to rise above. It was strength under pressure, grace in chaos, and leadership without fanfare. Drop a heart, type her name. Let the world know you watched her hold a plane steady while the storm tried to break it and win. She didn't just land the plane, she landed a truth the world needs to remember. You don't have to shout to be powerful. You just have to show up when it matters most. Captain Raymond Blake stood at the edge of the terminal, staring out at the rain-slicked tarmac. his reflection faint in the darkened glass. The plane was still parked beneath the floodlights, its engines now quiet, its frame still dripping from the storm they had barely escaped. Ground crews swarmed around it like ants, their movements quick, mechanical, life moving on. But Raymond couldn't move. Not yet. His hands were shoved into his uniform pockets, fists curled, jaw tight. He had flown hundreds of flights in his career, weathered his fair share of turbulence, rerouted, even handled emergencies. But nothing like this. Nothing that had left him standing on the other side of a storm, feeling like he was the one unmoored. And it wasn't the turbulence, it wasn't the loss of communication, or the near engine failure or the narrow runway they'd barely touched down on. It was her, Elena Brooks. He could still see her face, clear in his memory, focused, calm, grounded when everything else was shaking. She hadn't come into the cockpit to take over, hadn't demanded space. She had stood there with quiet command, like someone who belonged in the sky. She had known exactly what to do, when to speak, when to advise, when to step back and let him steer. And the hardest part, the part gnawing at him now like rust creeping under polished metal, was how close he'd come to denying her, dismissing her, not because she lacked skill, but because he couldn't see past his own assumptions. He remembered the beginning of the flight clearly now, but in a new light, how he'd glanced at her in first class with that faint flicker of doubt, the kind of look he'd given passengers he thought were lost or out of place. She hadn't looked like a typical first-class flyer. Her clothes too plain, her face too serious, her presence too quiet. And when she'd met his gaze, she hadn't flinched, hadn't smiled. She had just looked at it on, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking, because she had. And he hated knowing that she'd probably seen that look 1,000 times before. And then there was what she'd endured before the flight even took off. The check-in attendant had quietly flagged her ticket for verification. He'd overheard it, thinking nothing of it at the time. One of the gate agents had whispered to a colleague, "She's probably military. No one like that buys first class outright." Then there was the elderly woman in 2C who had offered to trade seats so Elena could feel more at ease back in coach. Blake hadn't intervened then either. He hadn't even noticed it all, hadn't thought it was his place to say something. But now the guilt swelled like pressure behind his ribs. And yet, she had still helped him. When he froze, when the radar lit up with chaos, when the sensors fed him lies, when the autopilot fought his every move, he hadn't said it aloud, but he'd been afraid. He had felt the edge of failure approaching fast and sharp, and in that moment, when he couldn't find clarity, Lena Brooks had stepped in. Not to shame him, not to push him aside, but to steady him. And because of her, 178 souls made it home. "Captain," came a voice behind him, soft, hesitant. He turned. It was one of the flight attendants, Laura, the youngest on the crew. Her eyes were wide with something close to awe. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Blake swallowed hard, then nodded once. "Yeah," he said, but the word tasted like dust. She hesitated, then added, "Miss Brooks, she was incredible. I mean, she didn't just help, she knew things. She saw what was happening before anyone else, and the way she handled herself, I've never seen anything like it." He nodded again, more slowly this time. "She saved us," Laura added. "I know," he said quietly. After she left, Blake stood alone again, and that was when he saw her. Elena, seated across the terminal in a far-off corner near the large windows, her duffel bag beside her, her posture upright, but her shoulders ever so slightly lowered, as though the weight of the flight had finally begun to settle in her bones. She wasn't on her phone, she wasn't writing. She was just still, watching the runway like she'd done it 1,000 times before, watching the sky calm itself again. For a moment he didn't move. He didn't know what to say, but something in her presence called him forward, like gravity in the space between two planets. He walked slowly, unsure, his steps heavier than they had been in years. When he reached her, she didn't flinch. She looked up, then gestured to the seat across from her. He sat. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The storm outside had faded to a drizzle. The terminal was quiet. The world had calmed, but something inside him hadn't. "I owe you an apology," he said at last, voice gravel thick. Not just for what happened in the air, for before that, for not seeing you. Elena didn't respond right away. She let the words hang in the air like something she was used to waiting for. I've spent my whole career believing knew what leadership looked like, he continued, believing I could read people, that my judgment was good. But today, I nearly let all of that get in the way of listening to the one person who could help us. Finally, Elena spoke, softly without blame. That happens more often than you think. He looked at her then, really looked. You shouldn't have to be extraordinary just to be seen. She nodded once. But sometimes you do. A silence passed. This time it wasn't heavy, just real. He leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter. You didn't just help me land a plane. You helped me land myself. You showed me what strength looks like when it doesn't need applause. And I won't forget that. She smiled, not wide, not triumphant, just true. That's all I ask. So if you've been following Elena's story, if you've sat with her in that cockpit, felt the storm in your bones, witnessed her rise when the world told her to be still, drop a comment for her, write her name, tell her you saw her, because the world needs more Elena Brooks, and not just to fly planes, but to teach us all how to land, with grace, with humility, and with power that doesn't need a microphone to change lives. She didn't just change the course of that flight. She changed the man who once doubted her. And that is the beginning of something bigger. Leadership doesn't always announce itself with volume or titles. Sometimes it walks in quietly when everyone else is frozen, finds clarity in the fog, and brings order to chaos without ever demanding the spotlight. That's what Elena Brooks did. In the moment when fear gripped the cabin and the storm outside seemed like it might swallow them whole, it wasn't the captain, the co-pilot, or the authority of a uniform that carried that plane forward. It was Elena's presence, her poise, her quiet command. She hadn't come to prove anything. She didn't enter the cockpit to conquer or replace. She stepped up because lives depended on it. And when others hesitated, she acted. Calm, focused, grounded. It wasn't ego that moved her forward. It was responsibility. And what made her leadership so powerful was that she never asked anyone to follow her. She simply led, and everyone did. In the hours that followed the landing, the story began to spread, first in whispers among the passengers, then in full retellings among crew and ground staff. She went into the cockpit, one man said. She helped land the plane, another added. But it wasn't just the outcome that moved people. It was how she did it. Passengers remembered how she'd stood without hesitation during the worst of the turbulence, moving through the aisle like she belonged there, like fear had no grip on her. The same woman some had looked at with confusion. First class? Really? Had become the reason they were hugging loved ones hours later. The same woman the captain had once questioned was now being talked about in reverent tones, not just for her skill, but for her composure. Elena had never raised her voice. She had never once needed to say, I told you so. Her strength had been steady, unflinching, and entirely selfless. A young woman named Renee, seated 3 rows behind Elena during the flight, couldn't stop talking about her. I watched her, she said to a nearby reporter at the gate. Before the turbulence even got bad, she was looking out the window, her posture different, alert, like she felt it coming. She didn't panic, not once. And when she stood up, I knew we were going to be okay. Another man who had initially joked about Elena looking out of place in first class now sat off to the side, silent and ashamed. He had watched her walk down the aisle with purpose, watched her knock on the cockpit door, while everyone else sat frozen in fear. And now he found himself unable to look her in the eye. In the crew debrief, the flight attendants spoke of her with admiration. Laura, the youngest among them, said, she knew what to do before anyone did. I didn't even believe her at first. I tried to stop her. And then she saved all of us. She stayed so calm, even when I was about to fall apart. Another attendant added, she wasn't loud, but you felt her power the second she spoke. It was like the air changed. But Elena didn't wait to be praised. She didn't linger for applause. After the formal report was taken, and the captain gave his reluctant but genuine acknowledgement of her role in saving the flight, Elena quietly gathered her things and moved toward the terminal's edge. She didn't need a crowd. She didn't need a microphone. That wasn't who she was. She had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. Still, the emotions clung to her like the damp air outside. She had stepped forward during a life-or-death moment, and in doing so, she had not only helped land a plane, she had shattered assumptions, transformed hearts, and redefined what real leadership looks like. Because real leadership is not about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the calm in the storm. It's about knowing when to step forward and when to let others rise. It's about reading the moment, not for opportunity, but for responsibility. And that's what Elena Brooks did. With no rank pinned to her chest, with no one calling her name, she led because the moment demanded her strength, and she gave it fully. So if you're listening to her story now, if you felt her calm when everything around her was shaking, if you saw the quiet fire in her when others tried to put her in a box, if you were moved by the way she lifted others without ever raising her voice, this is your moment to stand with her. Click that like button right now to honor the kind of leadership the world too often overlooks. Drop a comment to remind her and everyone else what real strength looks like. Say her name in the comments, Elena Brooks. Let her know you saw her, that you felt what she carried, that you understand how rare it is to watch a woman rise in grace when others retreat in fear. She didn't lead for recognition. She led because lives were on the line. And if you've ever had to lead in silence, if you've ever had to step up when no one expected you to, if you've ever been the only calm voice in a room full of panic, then you know what Elena felt that day. And you know the weight she carried into that cockpit wasn't just metal and weather and readings flashing red. It was decades of being underestimated. It was the sting of silence at the check-in desk, the whisper of doubt in the captain's eyes, the casual cruelty of being asked if she'd prefer economy. And still, she led, not in spite of it, but through it. She rose with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to carry herself in rooms that didn't want her. And when it mattered most, she made space not just for herself, but for everyone else to make it home. So if this story touched something in you, let it show. Like this. Share it. Let Elena's story fly far beyond that stormy sky. Because the world needs more leaders like her. Leaders who don't wait for titles to lead. Leaders who carry their strength with humility. Leaders who steady the room with their presence alone. Let's make sure she knows we saw her, and we will not forget. In the weeks that followed the flight, the story of Elena Brooks traveled farther than the aircraft she helped land. Passengers told it to their families with reverence. Flight attendants shared it across crew lounges in airports around the country, and even Captain Raymond Blake, once reluctant, now reformed, retold the story at a national aviation safety conference, citing her presence as the reason calm prevailed in the storm. The airline launched an internal review that didn't just applaud Elena's actions, it learned from them. Her name was added to a growing list of those being considered for the company's aviation advisory board. And when the airline invited her to return, not as a passenger, but as a guest speaker to help train future crew on leadership in crisis, she didn't hesitate. Elena said yes, not because she needed recognition, but because she believed in planting something better for those who would come next. Her journey had never been about fame. It had always been about responsibility. And now she had a platform to carry that further. Elena's phone buzzed for days with messages of gratitude. One came from a woman who had watched her silently from across the cabin. "I've spent years doubting if I belonged in rooms where no one looked like me," the message read. "But watching you walk toward that cockpit like you owned the sky changed something in me." Another came from a teenage girl who saw the viral clip from an airport interview. "I want to fly one day," it said, "and because of you, I believe I can." And that, more than the applause, more than the headlines, meant everything to Elena. Her actions had echoed far beyond the storm. She had become more than a pilot, more than a hero. She had become a mirror, one that helped others see their own power more clearly. But even as the world celebrated her, Elena remained grounded. She still drank her coffee black, still walked through terminals unnoticed, unless someone stopped her to say thank you, and still carried herself with the same quiet confidence that had steadied hundreds of lives midair. And that's what made her story so unforgettable. Not just the landing, but the woman behind it. Because what Elena taught us goes far beyond aviation. She taught us what it means to hold your ground in silence, to trust your instincts when others question them, to rise with purpose even when the world says, sit down. Her story reminds us that calm courage is not weakness. It is a strength forged through endurance, that being overlooked doesn't make you unworthy. It makes your success that much more powerful when it breaks through. That real leadership is not about who speaks the loudest, but who listens best, who stays steady when others shake, who steps up not for applause, but for the moment. Elena didn't need anyone's permission to rise. And in the same way, you don't need anyone's permission to be powerful. So whatever storm you're facing, whether in your workplace, your family, your community, or within yourself, remember Elena. Remember the woman who stood when no one asked her to, who helped save a flight because she refused to let fear, pride, or protocol stop her. And ask yourself, where am I being called to rise? Where in your life have you been quiet for too long, afraid to speak, afraid to step forward, afraid to lead because you didn't feel seen? Let Elena's story be your reminder that you do not have to be loud to be powerful. You don't need a title to lead, and you don't need permission to do the right thing. Her story is a victory not just for women in aviation, not just for Black women or veterans or first-class passengers who've ever been questioned. It's a victory for all of us, for anyone who's been underestimated, doubted, dismissed, or told they don't belong. Because Elena didn't just land a plane, she landed a truth we all need to hear, that dignity, courage, and composure still matter, that storms don't break everyone. They reveal the ones who were built for them. That leadership is not measured by how high you fly, but by how you carry others when they cannot fly at all. And now, as we close this story, we invite you, yes, you listening right now, to become part of that story. Drop a comment below if Elena's journey moved you. Let her know you see her. Let her know you believe in her. If you've ever been in her shoes, calm in chaos, silent in strength, we want to hear your story too. Hit that like button if you felt something in your chest as she walked into that cockpit, if her presence inspired you, if her courage reminded you of your own. And make sure to subscribe to this channel for more real, powerful, unforgettable stories like this one. Because we don't just tell stories, we lift voices. We honor quiet power. We share moments that remind us who we can be when it matters most. Elena Brooks didn't wear a cape. She wore jeans, a button-up shirt, and quiet fire. And in doing so, she reminded us that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks forward, knocks once on the cockpit door, and saves everyone.